All right, so before we start section 4 of chapter 2, let's think about an example, a real life example that illustrates the law of increasing opportunity cost, or the law of increasing additional cost, that we saw in the last section with our bowed or curved PPC. So this has to do with the airline industry. So the development of new technologies has increased the number of functions passengers wish to utilize, and hence the sizes of electronic gadget accessory boxes. So this is actually something that has sort of disappeared in the last few years, but if you were ever on a flight that had one of those uh, displays in the headrest in front of you, that's what this example is referring to. So with the advent of those devices, right, people really wanted to have those devices, but it came at a cost of the number of seats that the airline could put on its plane, because each of those devices took up a couple of inches of space, and if you multiply that over multiple rows, the airline basically had to give up an entire row of seats just so that it could have these devices in the headrest. So there you go. There's an example of a trade-off, an opportunity cost of having these devices. And so, yeah, actually, it's not clear to me how that relates to increasing opportunity cost or increasing additional cost, but nevertheless, it does illustrate the trade-off, right? So we could plot those things on a PPC graph, right? So we could right, electronic devices and headrests versus number of rows. Right, so if the airline wants to put more devices in, it's going to come at a cost of additional rows. So it might be, might be something like this, in which case the bowed shape indicates to us that that there's a increasing opportunity cost or increasing additional cost, right? So that might be an example of what a PPC for that real life example looks like. Okay, oops. All right, so moving on to section 4, we're going to basically take our PPC model and apply it in a specific use, okay? And it's going to have to do with economic growth, all right? So let's make sure before we talk about using this model for looking at economic growth, let's make sure we understand what economic growth is. But basically, economic growth is an increase in the production possibilities. Okay, so if we go back to our smartphone and tablet device example, economic growth in that model would be the ability to produce more of both things. Okay, now I asked you in the last video to think about, I think, what it would look like. And actually, wasn't the last video, is the one on the grade PPC. I asked you to think about what it would look like if you allocated more of your time to studying. Well, what that would be is basically an increase in resources, which would essentially be economic growth in the grade example, where you could get a better grade in both classes, right? So this is basically illustrated by a shift out in the production possibilities curve. And what economic growth means is that over time, it's possible to have more of everything without having to forego giving up something else, right? So in terms of our tablet and smartphone device PPC, this is what economic growth would look like, right? An increase in resources or technology, allowing us to produce more of both things over time. Okay, so that's what economic growth looks like. It's a shift outward of the PPC, or an expansion of the PPC as it moves out and away from the origin, being able to produce more of both things. Okay, so that's economic growth. And so what we're going to do now is apply our PPC to the trade-off between present and future consumption. So that's what we're headed towards here. So let's make sure we define what consumption is. So consumption is the use of goods and services for personal satisfaction or for obtaining utility, as we will talk about more in depth in micro. So there's two different types of there's two different types of goods we can define based on this definition of consumption. Consumer goods, which are goods produced for personal satisfaction. So most types of goods we experience in everyday life are consumer goods. And then there are goods that are not consumer goods, and those are called capital goods. So anything that's not manufactured for the purpose of consumption is manufactured for the purpose of producing other goods. So we talked about physical capital. That's basically what we're talking about here, but it also includes human capital. Capital goods are just goods that are used to make other goods and or services. Okay, so those are our two types of goods here, and those are going to be the two goods in our next model. Okay, so we're using the same model, the PPC model, and now we are looking at the trade-off between consumption today and production in the future, which that production in the future comes from capital goods. So here we've got on the left-hand side a PPC that relates consumption per year, consumption goods per year in trillions of dollars on the x-axis, and capital goods per year, presumably also in trillions of dollars, although it's not labeled. And so there's a trade-off, right? If we want to produce more consumption goods, we have to give up some capital goods and vice versa. All right, so let's look at point A here. So at point A, we are producing $9 trillion worth of consumption goods per year, and some, they don't put a number to it in the slides, but some positive amount of capital goods. Now, the production of those capital goods basically allows us to have more resources in the future, right? So recall that capital goods are one of our resources, right, for production. So if we are producing capital goods this year, those capital goods lead to an increase in our resources. And as we've already learned, when we have more resources, we experience economic growth, which is a shift out in the PPC. So that PPC on the right-hand side is our digital devices per year, plotted against game apps per year. So those are our two goods that we're trading off against one another. If we produce some capital goods, we have more resources in the future, and that would move our PPC for game apps and digital devices outwards so that we can have more of both in the future. So there we go. We've got some economic growth as a result of producing some capital goods. Now we could alternatively, instead of producing at point A, we could produce at point C. Now of course, if we produce at point C, we are going to give up some more consumption goods, so we're going to consume less this year, but that means we're able to produce even more capital goods, and if we produce even more capital goods, we experience higher economic growth. So the PPC on the right-hand side shifts out even further than it did here, right? So you can see the difference. Higher economic growth as a result of higher production of capital goods. But of course that came at a cost. We had to give up some additional consumption, all right? Going from here, we consume less in this picture than we do this picture. So there's a trade-off, right? There's a trade-off between economic growth and consumption, right? Here we're consuming less, but we have higher economic growth. Here we're consuming more, but we have lower economic growth. Okay, so this is a really nice application of our model. And this would allow us to actually to do some experimenting, some testing to see if this model makes good predictions. All right, so of course what we just saw was that with capital goods, it is possible to give up some consumption and produce more capital goods. And if we have more capital goods, then we can produce more in the future, so next year or the year after that, right? So that's the relationship between capital goods and growth. The more capital goods we have, the more growth we will have in the future. The more we'll be able to produce of everything, both goods, all types of goods in the future. That's economic growth. All right, so what we observed here is that an increase in capital goods at the present will lead to a higher rate of economic growth in the future, but of course that came at the cost of we had to give up some consumption in order to do that. And what economic growth means is that in the future the economic system can produce more consumer goods as well as capital goods, so more of everything again, right? So. All right, let's see here. We're going to wrap up this section with a real-life example, a question about a real-life application. So what would happen if the U.S. government continued to increase the required production of healthcare services? So most healthcare services, whether or not you knew this, come in the form of one-time services rather than longer lasting capital goods. So if we produce more healthcare services, they're these one-time services, we're going to have to give up production of longer lasting capital goods. So basically what this means in terms of our model is that we are giving up some capital goods in order to have those one-time healthcare services and consume those healthcare services. So the government's requirement for more healthcare services will likely slow the outward shift of the United States production possibilities curve. It will likely slow our economic growth, right? So there's a real life policy example, right? So if you go on to be an economist and someone asked you this, you could say, well, if the government requires more production of healthcare services, it will probably slow economic growth because we'll have to give up producing capital goods in exchange for those the higher production of healthcare services. All right, this concludes section 4 of chapter 2. I will see you in the next video for the last section, section 5 of chapter 2.